Today we have an amazing live with an amazing guest, and believe it or not, here he is. Today we've got Eric Helms with us, and we are going to have an amazing chat about a few things, and one of those will be about what are some principles on the pyramid of nutrition and strength pyramid that he designed with some other colleagues. Also talking a little bit about intuitive eating, but more so towards what would be the ideal scenario for an athlete or someone who wants to modify their body composition. Also talking a little bit about self-restraint and mindset and psychology. So let's see how we've got him on. So he's obviously, you might know who he is, but he's a strength and athlete researcher, scientific coach, and here it is. How are you today?
Doing well, Astrid. How are you?
I'm so good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me on. True pleasure.
Waking up in the morning as well, like me?
Hey, it's 11:30 here, so if I just woke up, then
not too bad then.
I'm good to go. Yeah, a little ahead of you here in New Zealand.
Well, we've got quite a few questions that I prepared for you, so let's get started so we can get the most out of this hour. And obviously, one of the main questions I had before even starting is, what led you to make you get where you are right now? What is the passion behind all the things you've done until right now?
That's a good question. So for me, getting into lifting was a positive, life-changing experience. It went from something that was a way of expressing angst, frustration, and a lack of being able to make changes in other aspects of my life, and eventually became something that became my career, my passion, a creative way of expressing myself, and gave me a sense of not only purpose, but also self-efficacy. Going through the process of getting on the platform, as well as the posing dais, was very transformative for me in a positive way. So I've always wanted to pay it forward, and also try to help people avoid the pitfalls, because many people have negative experiences with, especially weight class restricted strength sport, and definitely physique sport. So finding a way to give people more informed consent and better tools to integrate the positive aspects of their life and try to minimize any negatives.
And why bodybuilding? You're very into physique athlete and bodybuilding. Why that?
Yeah, I think there's very few sports in the lifting world that challenge you in the same way as bodybuilding, because it's not just about lifting, it's about pushing yourself to a place where your body, your mind, your physiology, your psychology does not want you to be, where you probably should not stay. And it is absolutely an extreme sport, but not in the same way that something like the high dive or American football, is where you're risking, concussion or serious injury. It's not like the X Games. It's messing with your behavior, and I found it so incredibly challenging that it was transformative. And I think that's an experience a lot of physique athletes share. It's almost kind of like that story of Icarus. You get too close to the sun, you get burned, but realizing that you can fly and get close to the sun is an exhilarating feeling. So I'm just trying to be the sunblock for the all the young Icari out there who are trying to do their thing in bodybuilding. And yeah, it's not for most people. I don't even necessarily like to see myself as a promoter of bodybuilding, but rather someone who wants people who are drawn to it to find the most positive aspect. But there's probably some parallel universe where I'm like a violinist and talking about that. I mean, I don't know, but not that I'm very good at I never played the violin. Don't get me wrong, but you get what I'm saying. It's just kind of the fate that life led me to. So,
do you find yourself being in a situation where you might have started like making a lot of mistakes, especially in the bodybuilding, where there was like a lot of bro science. There wasn't much evidence out there about certain things like going into peak week or how to do your best approach into dieting towards your last day of your day. What do you think was one of the main things you discovered along the way that made you to say, I wish I knew this was available when I was started?
Absolutely. You know, I was fortunate that I got involved with bodybuilding at kind of the beginning, or at least the early stages of the kind of the evidence-based explosion, if you will. You know, the mentors who I looked up to were like Dr. Joe Komaszewski, who was probably the first online bodybuilding coach to have existed, and he just happened to be, fortunate for all of us, someone who heavily values scientific inquiry, rational skepticism, and taking a applied scientific approach. And you know, you could look at Lane Norton as kind of like the first generation after him, and then I'm like the grandson of in terms of the coaching lineage of Dr. Joe. So I was very fortunate in that I got exposed to a scientific approach from the start. And what I wish, though, however, was that we'd had a more holistic view of evidence-based practice rather than a scientific approach. And I think there was a time where I was promoting a lot of logical fallacies, like evidence of absence being, or absence of evidence being evidence of absence, or really, if there wasn't a citation for it, I didn't buy into it. And not understanding the limitations of science, because I was just a young person, probably too early in my career, and I was very much promoting almost science as religion. It was the new guru, instead of really understanding what evidence-based practice meant, which is equal parts individual preferences, individual differences, experience, which is often propositioned against scientific value, and then also science. So I wish I had kind of been aware of that earlier. I think there would have been more respect for the psychology, emotional state, long-term outcomes, and the relevance of individual differences at an earlier stage in my career, and I probably could have promoted that more in hindsight, instead of it just being like, hey, what's the best way to be optimal? You know, instead of just kind of following tradition and repeating what prior champions or the biggest guy or gal in the room did. You know, let's just use PubMed. Both of those are problematic when you don't take into perspective the big picture. So that's kind of my perspective on probably the biggest mistake.
And I think you have a really important view when you're saying, look, evidence-based doesn't need to be completely backed up by a study or like citation. Evidence-based means that as a practitioner, you can say, I don't know as well. You can say, well, I don't have the information, but this is the honesty of saying this is not evident. There's not much evidence to support this, but I am being completely honest about it. And this also, it can be part of that evidence base, because as a practitioner, you have to show that science is always evolving, and you never know things that are not always definite, and at the same time, evidence is based on groups and studies over a population that probably doesn't necessarily goes into what your particular case would be. So experience comes into place, also the evidence, what is in there, and also what the client or the particular person, the context is also explaining. What are your thoughts about that?
I totally agree. I think there's a great quote that's attributed to Einstein that the value of a higher education, you know, going to university, is not in learning even more knowledge, but it's in learning how to think. And I think what underpins the scientific method is rational skepticism, is acknowledging the limits of our own observations, experience, and anecdotes, and then understanding the necessity of having higher quality observations, which all science is. It's just controlled observations and logical inferences, and then thinking probabilistically rather than just in good or bad terms. So I 100% agree with you. I would much rather have a practitioner who understands that, is comfortable saying, I don't know, and knows the limits of science rather than someone who's memorized all the data. I think knowing all the science is great, but the science is not designed to tell you what to do with your client on Thursday. There aren't studies on your clients for what's best on Thursday. Studies are designed to give you probabilistic inferences, like you said, about a population that is probably only loosely related to your client, and to give you the broad brushstrokes. So the natural handoff, that baton must get passed from the broad brushstrokes to what do I do on Thursday through your experiences and your understanding of principles of physiology, principle of psychology, and you have to make a decision in the absence of evidence. And in a field like sports science, you're almost always going to be operating in an absence of directive, clear, today applicable science. So you have to be able to act and not be paralyzed by the lack of the study that tells you what to do with Tom on Thursday. So 100%.
Yes, and I'm really curious because I know you one of the colleagues who created the strengthened pyramid for nutrition and training. What was the principle, or were the principles that you based on to sort of come up with that idea of creating that particular hierarchy of factors or components that are needed to get you to the best possible results?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And, I created the muscle and strength pyramids not because I was trying to battle bro science, as a lot of people would kind of position it, but more so because I was dealing with the fallout of science applied as marketing, or people not being able to distinguish between what is a nuance that doesn't matter versus something that makes a much larger impact. At the time I wrote the book, I was transitioning out of being a full-time coach, which I'd been for bodybuilders and powerlifters for the last 6 years by the time it was released. And I was doing maybe 3 to 4 Skype consultations a week, and about 2/3 of those were with someone who's not a repeat client. There were one-off people who had, hey, can you help me set up some basic information so I can guide myself, so I can create a nutrition or training program. And I found myself answering the same questions and giving people similar advice almost every single time. And it wasn't because people were misinformed. It was that they were overwhelmed by information. You could find a blog article, even that might cite scientific evidence accurately, that would make it seem like this was the most important thing for your game, or this peri-workout nutrition strategy, or this protein distribution strategy, or this manipulation of volume, or this manipulation of tempo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, were all the most important thing. And that's the way that science is used as marketing. If you look at the supplement industry, it's most obvious. They'll cite a study that might be loosely related to what you're interested in. We were able to make, a cell hypertrophy in a petri dish, or we were able to make a rat hypertrophy over 6 months, or we saw this marker. Yeah, it kind of gives loose support for this compound that's in, supposedly in this proprietary blend, the right amounts of a high quality. But then the claim is not supported by that research. It says, and you're going to gain, 3 inches on your biceps and 50 pounds on your bench in 25 minutes, or something like that. And that's, if people are looking to science for their answers and they see that, when you're just getting into this, the first check mark is, yep, science, therefore this is good, and I'll spend my money on it, or I'll hire the person, I'll buy the program on Instagram, etc. And so I looked up and I went, the problem isn't that people don't have access to information, it's they can't parse it out. So the nutrition pyramid is a hierarchy to help people understand not just what works, quote unquote, but what is actually worth investing your time and energy in, because it's going to have the largest effect. And many times the next rung of the pyramid will have no impact if you don't sort the first. So for example, with the muscle and strength nutrition pyramid, the base is behavior and lifestyle. That's the only way anything long-term is going to happen. That's actually outside of the pyramid. It's like everything encompasses of that. But then the first rung is energy balance. And you can do whatever you want with your macros, whatever you want with your meal timing. But if energy balance is completely the wrong direction from what you're trying to accomplish, it's very difficult to lose substantial body fat in a calorie surplus. It is very difficult to continue to gain muscle mass in a calorie deficit. At a certain point, you are going to run into the fact that you're lean, hungry, and just need more material. So I think understanding that hierarchy was most of what I did in those consultations where I helped people. I didn't have to necessarily re-educate them. I just had to help them let go of things that really didn't matter, but that were real, and focus on things that made a huge difference, that maybe they had known for a long time but weren't prioritizing. It's kind of like understanding that, yeah, this research does roughly support this. It's like the equivalent of saying, yeah, if I take a shot glass of water and I throw it in the ocean, there is more water in the ocean, but it doesn't matter. So, and I think I stole that analogy from John Berardi to give some credit, but I think a lot of people spend a lot of time majoring in the minors. They focus on all these minutiae instead of understanding that really getting a solid progression plan, setting an appropriate volume, frequency, intensity, setting the appropriately sized deficit or surplus, eating enough protein, those really do make the vast majority of the difference. And it was surprising to me how often well-intentioned and well-informed people were not getting that right.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I probably think you get a question a lot when you say, well, energy balance is the main thing you need to use for driving your results. If you're looking to lose fats, you need to be in a calorie deficit. So a lot of people come back and, so that means that I can eat whatever I want, and it doesn't matter if I don't eat, I just eat only brownies throughout the whole prep, and I still in a calorie deficit. Can I achieve my results eating poorly, quote unquote poorly, and still be in a calorie deficit and get results like six-pack and things like that? Or do you think, is that realistic?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely, and I don't have a problem with that question, because now they've at least, they've got their first priority in order. And I go, that's perfect, great. Well, where do calories come from? They come from the macronutrients. And okay, the biggest thing we need to understand now is that, yeah, we need energy, so fat and carbohydrates. It should probably be tailored to your needs, depending on your activity levels and your individual response. And then we also need sufficient protein to either, to maximize muscle mass, whether we're in a deficit or surplus, so we can guard against muscle losses for, an advanced lifter in a deficit who's trying to diet down very lean, or grow it in a surplus. So I think, that argument keeps getting pushed. Like, I'm fine with that, because then the person keeps kicking the can down the road. Like, the next one from that is, well, okay, if I just take like soy protein and maltodextrin and just saturated fat pills, and then is that okay? Then I go, well, no, okay. There isn't. Micronutrients are also important, including zoonutrients and phytonutrients, and I'm moving them up the pyramid. And each one of those straw man arguments they give, the answer is not it's black or white, which is the way people tend to think. They tend to think, if you need to prove something wrong by creating a logical fallacy, it means you probably don't understand it, So instead of it being, if it fits your macros or bro science, I tried to help people understand that, yeah, like energy balance, big piece of the picture, really big piece of the picture as well, sorting your macronutrients, but that's not everything. It's really important to make sure your micronutrient quality there, fibers, nutrients, phytonutrients, and you probably don't want to have just one meal a day, if you're trying to maximize muscle retention or muscle gain. So there is some importance on meal timing, meal frequency. There's small effect perhaps of having protein around training, small effect of distributing protein evenly. And then, it's not like supplements are magical. Even the best ones out there with years of research, like creatine, are going to make a difference you wouldn't actually be able to notice. That's why they do placebo-controlled trials. And the groups in the placebo group, they don't know they got placebo. So it absolutely does something, but it is so minor in the grand scheme. Should you buy creatine? Why not? But I think my goal is more so not that people remember, what citations I had and what guidelines I gave in each one of those levels, but just to move away from thinking in terms of this is either good or bad. And at the start of both of my books, I challenge the reader to ask better questions. So, for example, in the training book, is high volume better than lower volume? That question, it implies there's a problem with with asking. Like, you don't understand, like, in what context, for who, what is high, what is low, what movement is your goal to get bigger? So that's kind of the way that I created the pyramids, is for you to understand them. You have to think in a more logical way. You have to think a little more completely, and it forces you, therefore, to look through all the information that comes to you through a new lens, which is ultimately what I tried and hope I accomplish when people are exposed to it.
And I think it is a really good base to get someone started and comprehend the relevance of each of the hierarchy, and how everything correlates to each particular hierarchy and position. But obviously you gotta be focused on making sure you nailing down the first base of the pyramid. And if you want to get results, you cannot just go directly to getting supplements, but rather start on the base of the pyramid, set up your base energy balance, how much deficit you need to go in. And actually this leads to my next question. When it comes to setting your deficit, and especially with, not necessarily with a physique athlete, but more so with someone who is a gym goer, a fitness enthusiast, when it comes to setting a deficit, how do you calculate based on their goal in the time, let's say 12 weeks, they want to be losing a certain amount of fat, or maybe body fat from 20% to 12% of body fat? How do you determine that deficit for them?
I normally work backwards from a reasonable rate of weight loss. So we've got data on lean people, looking at case studies on natural bodybuilders and athletes losing weight. We know that losing weight too quickly, it reduces the proportion of fat mass lost to lean mass. So you'll lose more fat, but at the cost of additional lean mass. And this becomes more apparent the leaner you are when you start. So in the example you gave, if that's a woman dieting from 20% to 12%, that's pretty much a contest prep, starting like halfway through for most women. If that's a guy going from 20 to 12%, that's starting at a very healthy, normal body fat, despite what Instagram will tell you that for some reason 15% is what all lifters need to be and no higher. But 20%, very normal, healthy body fat. If you're active, you're probably going to have great blood work. And then going down to 12% is actually reasonably lean. And it may or may not be sustainable for most people. So assuming it is sustainable, assuming it is something that comes with appropriate behavior change, the person is not already struggling on their current diet, and this isn't like the fourth or fifth time they try to get to 12%. And they have a big mindset on, how do I maintain this long term, or maybe I'm going to do this, but just to make room for more weight gain down the track if I want to gain more muscle. If they have all that in order, and that's a huge question, then I would probably advise them to lose between about 0.5 to 1% of their body weight per week, which is going to roughly correlate to a certain deficit. If we use that 3,500 calorie kind of rule of thumb, guideline of thumb even, we can go, okay, if you're a 180-pound male, we're looking at 0.9 to 1.8 pounds of weight loss per week. That's just under a kilo at the highest. And then, we adjust the deficit based on that. If we know that roughly 3,500 calories deficit accumulated over a week will probably produce about a pound of loss. So that's basically how I operate. I back calculate, which means they have to know some things on the front end. They have to know what they're currently eating. Are they currently maintaining weight? Are they currently gaining weight? So immediately this prompts some other steps. They have to do some tracking. They have to learn the ropes of understanding what they're currently eating. And I think there's some really important stuff there as far as making sure that it is an appropriate goal right now to diet and lose weight. Because just because your body fat's reasonably high and you can get it down so it not being too low doesn't mean that a fat loss phase is a innocuous intervention. For certain people, that could result in them being 22% body fat only 3 weeks after finishing that cut. And it did more harm than good actually going through that cutting process. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very important thing that you mentioned. And it goes back to your mindset and how ready you are to lose fat or get into a fat loss phase right now. Sometimes it's not the right time, even though you want to do it and you really wish that was the best scenario. Sometimes might be in the best place to get you into a deficit or put you some more stress on your system, or like looking at being efficient and a fat loss phase and really endure it and enjoy it. Because sometimes whatever is happening in your head, in your mindset, in your life could be could make it very difficult, or could just make it not very sustainable or enjoyable if your mindset is not there, or the situation. Like, let's say the situation that happened over this year with COVID. Some people wanted to keep following their goals of losing weight, but there was so much stress around them, and the situation was so much different that they needed to sort of shift their focus, at least for a while, to manage anxiety, to manage stress, to depression, and other things that were more important, especially mental health, when it comes to mental health, and not necessarily just address the one thing that they were following. But it doesn't mean that they can resume that goal later on when they're ready. So readiness is very important, and mindset as well.
100%. Totally agree.
Let me go to the other question, and I really wanted to get your thoughts. And what are some strategies that you use, especially when people dieting, to manage hunger and really work with satiety regulation, especially meaning to be more in tune with the body cues?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think, I'll try to answer this without opening up a huge can of worms. But in the end, I think it's really important on the front end to know why you're dieting. So if you're dieting to a place where it requires extreme hunger to get there, and it means it'll probably still be there even when you return to maintenance. You know, there should be some hunger on a diet. That's normal. That's completely normal. And there's even data to show, if you look at weight loss trials, there's a method called acceptance therapy, which where basically you counsel the people who are going through weight loss to know that they're going to have slightly lower energy, be a little more frustrated, and that they're going to be hungry. And that if they accept this on the front end, they tend to have better adherence in the long run, because it normalizes what their experience is. They understand it's kind of a, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So I think that's really important to. It's easy when we start talking about like an evidence-based approach or flexible dieting, quote unquote, to make it sound like you can eat whatever you want, you won't be hungry, it's great, it's easy, but that's simply not the case. And I think people need to be have realistic expectations and know that it might be challenging. This is behavior change, this is life change, and that's normal. What I deal with, especially if we're going to be talking about people who are like reasonably fit and they're trying to diet to get leaner, I think the question becomes are you expecting to maintain the leanness you get to? Because I can't tell you how many times, a lot of those consultations were the same guy trying to get from like 20% to 12%, not the exact same guy, but the same story, trying to get from 20% to 12%. It was like their fourth time doing it. And they thought, oh, I did the right hunger management strategy. I should have done IF, or I should have gone higher protein, or I should have gone lower carb, or I should have eaten more fruits and vegetables. And they think if I can just find some way to manage my hunger and I can live with a controlled amount of hunger for the rest of my life, then I'm good to go. And I think that it implies that if you have to live with hunger, you're trying to stay too lean. And that's something that people just couldn't accept. So anyway, I think that's a really important place to start from. If you're trying to get to a place that will result in hunger constantly, it's simply too lean. And it's not like, hey, how lean is too lean? Will it mean that my testosterone's lower or my sleep get affected? Not. Too lean is whatever you can't maintain. Like if you're hungry, that's too lean. Pretty much, you can obviously modify your food selection. For example, we know that lower energy density diets lead to less passive consumption. So for example, if you were to take a pound of broccoli, or if you were to take a pound of a fatty steak, or a pound of cheesecake or something like that, same weight, same stretch sensing in your gut, long digestion times for both, but very few calories in broccoli. So people generally eat roughly a similar mass of food, but when you look at, say, vegetarians, for example, they tend to walk around with lower BMIs. They probably have higher satiety. We also know that we live in a hyper-palatable food environment. There's cheap, calorie-dense food that tastes great. It's not really normal, even though we talk about it all the time, to eat something and for it to make you want to eat more of it. Typically you eat something and then you get satisfied and you're done. You can't just have one chip or one Oreo kind of thing. So you can do a lot of things. You can change your food environment. You can only buy fruits and vegetables and largely single item and ingredient foods for your house. You can eat a high protein diet. You can eat fruits and vegetables every meal. You can have low energy density. You can avoid hyperpalatable foods. And you can also, there's another thing, is you can be less sedentary. So there's data on what's called the J-shaped curve of activity. So sedentary people don't regulate their hunger as well. They also burn less calories, so it's easy to overeat because satiety is less well regulated. And then it's easier to be in a calorie surplus because you're just not burning as many calories. But then if you look at people who have a moderate level of activity all the way up to very high, for their height, they have the same body weight, which means they just eat more. They automatically regulate their energy intake. So that's where you really want to be. So these strategies are great while dieting, but once they stop working, that tells you that, look, you've modified your food, you've modified your activity, your habitual relationship with satiety and hunger is restored. You're no longer in kind of that same obesogenic environment that most people are living in. You've got your activity and your food sorted, and hopefully you've changed your behavior. And if you are still hungry, then you're just trying to be too lean. So anyway, to answer your question, do all those things, right? Get your activity levels up, eat a high protein diet, eat lots of fruits and vegetables, and have an appropriate size deficit, say, 0.5 to 1% of your body weight. And also maybe take some diet breaks, practice maintenance every month or 2 months, somewhere in there. So you get to see what it's like. And then once you get to your fat loss goal, go to roughly estimated maintenance and see how you feel. And if you're still hungry, that's a problem. It's probably not something you can maintain. It's also important to remember that you shouldn't have to track to maintain a body weight. If it fits your macros as you keeping your finger in the dam so the water doesn't shoot out, eventually that's going to fail because you're not going to want to track your macros for your whole life, nor should you. You should be able to leverage your hunger and satiety. If I was to create like a 1 to 10 hunger scale, 10 was I'm uncomfortably stuffed, nauseous, I might vomit if you push me wrong, and I can't lay down in a bed, I gotta sleep in a recliner, like Saturday post show after I had my binge. And then 1 is I am starving, not like the thing I say to my wife on Saturday when we decide to order pizza, but I'm actually starving. I've been 6 months dieted and I'm 5% body fat as a male, and I feel low energy. I'm foggy, I'm irritable, I get woken up in the middle of the night, I'm so hungry. On that scale, if you want to hang out between like 4 to 6, that's probably what will result in weight maintenance. If you're doing all the other things right that will lead to that auto-regulation, you take yourself out of that obesogenic environment. If you're trying to gain weight, you can just shift up to like 5 to 7. You probably shouldn't be totally stuffed all the time. And if you're trying to lose weight, you can shift down to like 3 to 5. So you get reasonably hungry, and then when you finish eating, you're satisfied, but you're not full. And that's a way to transition from tracking macros and hitting targets and then moving into actually using satiety cues. And the benefit of that is that when you purely focus on just hitting numbers, that's using an external cue versus an internal cue, that tends to degrade interoceptive awareness, which means that when you try to go back to living life, you put away MyFitnessPal, you don't use the food scale, you're going to struggle because you don't know what hungry and full feel like. But if you can track macros in concordance with tracking hunger and satiety and then slowly phase out the macros, you're going to find that transition to regular life much more easy.
And that leads you perfectly to our topic of, obviously we want to not track all for the rest of our lives, but we also want to make sure we get in and paying attention to our internal cues and how our body is managing and respond to our body in a much more connected way than just looking at how many calories do I have left in MyFitnessPal or tracking over all the time. So my question would be, there is a lot about eating intuitively or intuitive eating, and I know this is something that probably is not necessarily to lose weight. It's not a diet. It's nothing related to that. But there are 10 principles that are into the intuitive eating approach that could potentially be extracted or used when you're dieting or when you're trying to maintain, and not necessarily follow that movement in particular, but extracting some of these things, like stop thinking that you have to diet for the rest of your life, or stop negating your hunger and satiety cues, or maybe stop the food police and try to look at foods like they are equal. So my question comes to you into what's your stance on eating intuitively and bringing some of these cues and principles into a diet phase or even into maintenance phase?
For sure. I think it is important, like you said, to clarify that intuitive eating, like TM, is a 10 principled weight neutral approach. And it's really helpful for people who have been stuck in the loop of weight loss, weight regain, don't have a healthy relationship with food or their body. And it is a fantastic way to simply have a little more self-love, not have so much shame and lack of acceptance around who you are, not to tie your self-worth into your body, and reattune yourself with internal signals. And it is importantly weight neutral. It is absolutely not related to body composition change at all. It is also part of the movement that understands that there is wellness and health-seeking behaviors that are related to nutrition that are independent of weight loss. Simply eating higher quality foods more regularly, listening to your internal signals, is reliably improves health. Because most Americans, they also follow external cues, but very different ones than most bodybuilders. All the macronators out there, the external cue is MyFitnessPal targets and the body weight scale. For most people in the Western world who are struggling with their body weight or their body image, that might be the obesogenic environment, which is an external cue. Both of them have been modifying the way we are. And both can lead to disordered eating. They just look different. One person might be trying to stay too lean. The other person has been trying to lose weight for the last 10 years. And both are not good. So some of the aspects that come from this that are useful, I think, is that those awareness of internal cues and removing your self-worth from your image. I think in health and fitness, we have this idea that having abs is somehow just better in general for performance or for health. And I don't think that's true almost in any case that I can think about. If you are currently someone who has got good blood work, is active, trains, eats well in terms of having a lot of fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, all of that, high micronutrient quality, and you diet, that's not going to make you healthier. It has more potential to make you less healthier. So I think that's important to understand. So the elements of those principles that are helpful, and I actually proposed this in a paper we wrote about paradigm changing nutrition and bodybuilding, are some of those internal cues that we can create behaviors that are sport supportive, like sitting down for a meal as a bodybuilder or someone who's interested in strength or hypertrophy or especially weight loss maintenance. You probably want to have protein and or fruits and or vegetables with every meal. Like, that's a great way to get that energy density down, micronutrient quality up, fiber intake high, satiety higher, and also all the muscle building or retaining amino acids that you need. So doing that is an example of a behavior, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to track it. The portion sizes of your fats and carbs can be totally related on that hunger scale that I talked about. So you can always kind of have a kind of set protein serving in your 3 to 5 meals per day, whatever, if you're a normal person or an athlete. But then, you got your fruit, you got your vegetable, you got your glass of water or your tea or whatever. Like, that's just kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis. But if you're hungrier, have more carbs or fat. And I think that's a really useful tool, is to kind of tailor that athlete or that fitness structure of eating to then incorporate hunger and satiety. So I think that's basically the way I would apply those principal tools. That said, there are some goals which really don't align well with trying to be aware and sensitive to your hunger and satiety. Like when you are trying to get down to the point when you have lines in your butt or like veins in your abs, you're always going to be hungry. So like, you sit here and think about the meal like, oh, I'm still fucking tired and hungry. I don't want to do this. And I think that is a good time to get a little more mechanical. I've just got my kind of meal plan. I hit my targets and that's it. I might adjust if I had a really big day of energy expenditure and just go on. But then I do think it's important to reestablish that relationship and understanding of your hunger and satiety. So for example, we have what we call the recovery diet. Once a competitor has gotten on stage, we put them in the largest surplus they'll see because we're trying to get them back to a healthy but still athletic body composition, which means we might give them 1,000 calorie surplus and only 1/4 of the cardio they're doing in prep to try to purposely gain back lean body mass and fat mass to accelerate the recovery and also make them start thinking about hunger and satiety. And we've seen a much faster transition to getting healthy again and much smaller rebounds in terms of body weight post-show, which we can talk about as well.
So what would you say that the difference would be for you, and which one do you advocate more for when it comes to reverse dieting and the recovery diet?
Yeah, I think it depends on how you define a reverse diet. The reason why I don't use the terminology, I don't promote that, is because it actually implies that you are doing the same thing coming out of it. Like it's a slow, purposeful, gradual increase in calories, and it is for the purpose of reversing your diet, rather than actually trying to recover from what is a stressful state. So for example, if we look at most physique competitors, they get to a place where they're shredded and they get rewarded from that. The leaner you are, the better you'll do. That's social currency within the tribe of physique athletes. As much as we probably should divorce our self-worth from our performance, people have athletic identities, right? But we also understand, like, I can't be there all the time, but I kind of want to be as close to it as I can. And you can tell yourself this is because it makes the diet easier. But it's bodybuilding in the end. And this is something that you'll burn out from real quick if you try to stay too lean. So I think it's very attractive. It's tantalizing to be told that, hey, you can kick your macros up real high and stay lean. But the goal isn't to eat a lot of macros. The goal is to recreate the hormonal environment, sleep environment, and psychology of someone who can have a productive off season. And that's not somebody who is, cheering every time they get a meal and they're living meal to meal to meal and all they can think about is food and their Instagram becomes just this food porn stream. Like, you need to get out of that mindset. That's inevitably going to happen, but it's not where you should hang out. So the reverse diet can promote a lot of that. It depends on what that looks like. If you're only going up like 10% in calories, cutting your cardio in half and adding, 10 grams of carbs and 5 grams of fat every other week, that's almost the data would suggest that would predict future binge eating episodes. Restriction is what prompts binge eating. If we look at some of the behavioral correlates at baseline that predict weight regain and overshoot in weight loss cohorts, it's two things. It's high levels of disinhibition or high levels of rigid restraint. So disinhibition is obvious. That's someone who is very impulsive in their eating, follows hedonistic cues. They might plan to go and get a salad and chicken, and they go, you know what, screw it, I deserve it, I'm getting the pasta. And this often comes from the fact that they've been on and off diets already. So they get enrolled into a weight loss program, they're already struggling just to follow their normal diet. How do we expect it's going to go if they adhere to it, if they actually follow it? If they grit out that 12-week, 4-month study, maybe with the encouragement and the help from the dietitian who's part of the weight loss program, it's going to go to hell in a handbasket as soon as it's over. And that's higher prediction based on more disinhibition. But conversely, it's the exact opposite for someone who's restrained. So if you're currently have rigid restraint, you're already following a strict diet, you have to do all these things that I've been talking about that aren't that good to maintain body weight, and then you go into a diet, all of that pendulum shift is just going to eventually swing back. You're going to get even more strict. They're going to give you a lot of these like medical weight loss diets are like 800, 1200 calories. If you're white knuckling it, maintaining 10,000 steps and eating 1800 calories, and then you go into a weight loss trial because you just think I've got to be leaner, and you do a 1200 calorie diet, it's going to go to hell in a handbasket when that's over. So if you look at the people who successfully maintain weight loss long term, It is people who were not already experiencing a high level of disinhibition or a high level of rigid restraint. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the people who are trying to lose weight, and that's why we see such bad numbers in terms of weight loss retention, are people with those two issues. You know, they're either successfully dieting and maintaining that weight loss, or they are unsuccessfully dieting and trying to, and they feel they should lose weight. And both are just kind of two sides of the same coin. People don't often get put in a position where they're good and able to maintain weight, have healthy behaviors, have good interoceptive awareness, have changed their eating behavior without the goal of losing weight. So I think that's where you need to get to first before you do weight loss, and that's super uncommon. And if you think about what a bodybuilding prep is, it is getting to the point where to get there, you must have rigid restraint. You must be a restrained eater. You must ignore your interoceptive cues. You must go counter to your physiology and psychology. So then trying to stay lean or stay in a slight deficit or only give a slight surplus is going counter to what your body needs and wants. And it creates this dissonance inside of you that can lead to cyclical, almost bulimia-like outcomes. You know, you try to follow the reverse diet, and then you binge. And then you go, well, got to get back on track. And you have like a 1,800 calorie day, like only protein and veggies. That's like for a male. Might be 1,200 calories for a lightweight female. And then you're able to stick to that, and you get back on the reverse diet, and then you binge. And it looks the same as the recovery diet. The time course of weight gain is the same. It's just more variable, and you're way more stressed, and it typically leaves you in a status of low energy availability longer, and hormonal recovery can take longer. There was a case study of a female figure athlete. It took her 1.5 years for her menstrual cycle to come back, and they mentioned in the discussion that she was trying to control her weight gain post. So that's why we lean into the physiology. We say, look, let's take 6 weeks, and we'll get you right back to where you started this diet. Because you started this diet in a good off-season position. You look great. Your friends complimented you. You didn't look like, you know, you had the sucked up face. You didn't have lines in your butt if you're a male. That's not sustainable, nor should it be. We're not going to waste our time spending 6 months before we're even in a good hormonal environment to gain weight. Then blow it, gain a whole bunch of weight, and spend your whole off-season going back and forth on mini cuts. Let's get it done. If you were just 5% body fat over the weekend, I want you to come back to me at 12% in 8 weeks.
Yeah, so I was going to follow up with that question. What would be a target to gain certain amount of weight or going back to a certain body fat to say, well, this is the time frame we want to spend on a surplus, or let's say from your actual current maintenance to additional extra surplus? How would you manage the surplus over time to get this person into a good body fat percentage in a good position and avoiding like this fat overshooting that potentially when we are so lean, that is so likely to happen even when we go on a surplus like this?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's not like a whole bunch of data on how to do this, but we actually there's a kind of a failed study that came out of Bill Campbell's lab where they tried to compare reverse diet to a recovery diet, and people who just couldn't do the slower diet. So they ended up just comparing the outcomes rather than which group followed what group. And they absolutely observed that recovery of metabolic rate, recovery of total energy expenditure was better in the people who didn't stay as lean. So, you know, we have to create some system and some loose guidelines, but know that this must be individualized. And what we generally recommend is gaining around 5 to 10% on top of your stage weight within 1 to 2 months. And what this normally looks like as far as what do we change, I normally bring someone down to only 1 or 2 cardio sessions a week at most, depending on how much cardio they're doing. If they're only doing 1 or 2 cardio sessions, then we just cut it out. And I normally increase their calories to, depending on the size of the person, like 800 to 1,200 from where they were.
Mm-hmm. Over the actual calorie maintenance.
Absolutely. So this might look like a 1,500, 1,600, 1,700 calorie bump if we're talking about a male, or just a large female competitor as well. This also assumes that we did get in really good shape. You know, for someone who, you know, a first-time competitor in a softer division, that will be much more tempered. You know, might look at half that surplus size. You know, but if we're talking about like a physique or bodybuilding division, male or female, who got on stage at like, 10% body fat for a woman or 6 or 5% body fat for a man, yeah, they're going to get a big calorie jump. And that's what their body wants anyway. If you don't do that, like what I used to observe, and here's the thing, we tried the reverse diet for a couple of years with 3DMJ, and we had like a 90% failure rate. No exaggeration. I remember giving people, they finish their diet with, daily cardio, let's say 1,800 calories. We're talking about like a middleweight male. That's like the deepest, darkest they got. And I'm like, all right, let's get them to maintenance. That's what I want to do. And then we'll bump it up like 100 calories from there. It's not even an unreasonable one. So they come out of the gates and I take them right to 2,500 and I bring them down to cardio every other day. And they maintain that, and then they have a 7,000 calorie blowout. What I'm proposing is, instead of having like these cyclical 7,000 calorie blowouts, instead of going to like 2,500, we go to 3,500 and cut the cardio down even further. And those 7,000 calorie blowouts become like maybe 1/4 as frequent, and maybe a few thousand calories less, and they actually gain less weight and they feel better faster. And also they tend to return to normal eating behavior much earlier, because they're not trying to follow this unattainable goal. They were able to white knuckle it and restrain themselves into getting on stage because they had the stage as the motivator. But now they can rationalize that, I feel terrible, I don't want to do this to my family or my friends, like they deserve this, I deserve this, I'm just going to have this appetizer, and then it turns into a binge, and then, oh my God, I was able to restrain this for 6 months, and I don't even feel like a bodybuilder, and it just kind of goes off the deep end. But when they're told the purpose is to gain body fat right now, the purpose is to be in a surplus, all of a sudden when you remove that restriction, it becomes much more moderate, much more controlled, and we have something like more like a 70% success rate versus a 10% success rate, anecdotally.
Would you say you maintain resistance training normal and the same frequency, so at least you're ensuring that a lot of that surplus is going to a good place and not necessarily to body fat, because you're in such a delicate place that you can gain over fat so quickly in a surplus in a very lean state, that maybe having that sort of frequent resistance training, even if you're not doing cardio, you maintain that stimulus to use that amount of extra energy to dispose it to a better place, let's say lean body mass.
I think a really important thing to remember is that the recovery diet really only makes sense for physique competitors. Most people, there's literally zero reason to diet to a body fat level you can't sustain unless you're a fitness model doing a photo shoot, or you're getting on stage where you're competing at being incredibly lean. For anyone else, dieting to a place that you can't sustain is just doing something that you can't maintain. And probably, like, if you diet to, let's say you're a male and you can maintain 14% body fat, dieting to 10% body fat, you're more likely to end up at 16% body fat because you're going to overshoot. But if you actually just dieted to 16% or 14%, sorry, you might be able to stay there. And you could apply, add 10% for that for a woman, or 12%, and to get an idea of what kind of equivalence. So I think for what I'm talking about, they were already resistance training, and I don't want to increase their frequency. I don't want to increase, the training load or intensity or anything like that, because the reason why they're unable to maintain or gain muscle towards the end of prep is because of the environment they're in, from being in a deficit and being very, very low in body fat and experiencing months of low energy availability. So if you fix that, all of a sudden training that was doing a decent job of maintaining muscle is now sufficient to stimulate muscle growth. As soon as their hormonal environment recovers, they can actually sleep for more than 4 hours straight, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't actually increase training stress. I keep training.
You keep it the same.
Pretty much, yeah. And if they're bored of it, or some cosmetic changes, we can swap out exercises. We can do things like that, change the schedule a little bit. But a lot of people do want to increase training frequency. Like, I got another 1,500 calories. I got to do something with it. And I'm like, reminder, the goal is to gain body fat right now. Nobody wants you to have.
It can be hard.
Walnut.
It can be really hard.
It's very difficult. By far, the biggest challenge for people is getting their psychology turned around, where they were agonizing over every line on their quadricep and seeing the scale go down 0.1 to purposely gaining weight. And that is something that you don't start talking about Saturday night after the show. That's something you start talking about 4 weeks out, and you really start to try to shift their mindset 100%.
It can be so hard, especially because I could see that probably mostly in women, that they work so hard to get there. They're in the best shapes of their lives, and they have to give that up just because obviously it's not healthy and it's not maintainable or sustainable over time. But they have to gain weight again, and it's like, oh my God, this is going to be completely opposite to what I would like for me to be in. I wish I could stay this lean for the rest of my life. And I think that's where it comes, this shock of letting this go and sort of moving away from it and starting gaining weight. That can be very shocking.
100%. And there's so much reframing that needs to be done there. And also, it teaches a competitor what their why is. And if they do see it like you described it, that I'm in the best shape of my life, this is the best I've ever looked, and I want to maintain this, that's a problem, right? That means that their view of looking my best is starved. You know, that tells them about, wow, how has society affected me? I need to be at a body fat percentage where I can't even carry on the human race, where I can't sleep through the night, where I'm weaker, where I can't gain muscle, where all I can think about is food, where my libido is down. You know, my body has turned off about 30% of its functioning so that I can be alive right now, and I'm in the shape of my life. I think the reframe that I try to do as a coach is, you're in the best competitive shape of your competitive career, but you're in terrible shape for life, you know? Like, that's absolutely not the goal. And competitive bodybuilding needs to be framed in that way for people to view it in a way that is sustainable. If the only time they like what they see when they look in the mirror is when they're on stage, that's not how you'll be a successful athlete, and that's not how you have a healthy relationship with sport. You've got to be motivated to make progress, and progress doesn't come from staying shredded all the time. And a physique competition isn't a proxy for having an excuse for trying to maintain an unrealistic and unhealthy body image. So I think people need to be in physique sport because they want to be physique athletes. And I think they need to separate their athletic identity from their self-worth and even their sense of self-beauty. And that's not easy, don't get me wrong. The way I normally explain this to people is, you need to see being shredded as the same as, you know, throwing a 90-mile-per-hour fastball. You know, an MLB baseball pitcher is going to have shoulder problems for most of their life. And that's why they have relief pitchers. That's why, you know, you take yourself out of games. This is why you're only allowed to have a certain number of concussions in rugby or American football before you sit down, or you have to retire. And I think you have to view physique sport the same way. If you look up after a season and you want to walk around in a condition that, like I said, is not conducive to life, it makes your sleep, relationship with food, relationship with other people, ability to gain muscle, which supposedly is why you got into bodybuilding in the first place, worse, then you need to take some time away from the sport until you can recalibrate things and you can make your values and your why align with your actions. And this is why I don't advise athletes compete every year, because it's easy to get caught up in that mentality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think this is the best way to sort of conclude our live, because this is probably going to shut off now anytime. But I so appreciate it for your time, for having come along and talk to me and to everyone that was present with all this amazing knowledge you have. And thank you so much again for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for the kind words, and thank you everyone for watching.
I will see you very soon.
All right. Take care, Astrid. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.